Hello, everyone. My name is Colin, and my presentation is on deafness and identity. This is from chapter 2 of Far from the Tree. So to begin, we should go over the history of deafness. So in this book, it starts with St. Paul with his letter to the Romans, which he says, faith comes by hearing. So St. Paul was an early apostle of Christianity, an early leader, and the Romans really took what he had to say to heart. They create a set of rules that force deaf people to not progress in government or even get any type of jobs. They were not allowed to own property or marry, so they were completely shunned by society. Early nobles would educate their children, so this would mean they would do what they could to try and integrate them into normal society, but for the most part, this was not available to the average person. So most deaf would congregate in communities by themselves. Um, and then in the early 17th century, Abbé de la Épée was a French educator who traveled to Paris with the intent of learning more about deaf culture and the deaf community. While interacting with them, he taught them how to write in French and read French so they could actually be part of society. Following that, a lot of the people started to work, or a lot of the deaf people started to work in society, integrate themselves normally. And then in the early 18th century, Reverend Thomas Gallaudet sought to learn more about the deaf, and this was him coming from America, to, specifically Connecticut, with the intention of going to England. When he arrived in England, the English told him that their linguist ways were secret and that he wasn't allowed to learn them. So he then traveled to France, where de la Épée accepted him with open arms, and he actually took Laurent Leclerc, or asked him to accompany him back to Hartford, Connecticut, where he would establish a school known as the American Asylum for the Education and Instruction of the Deaf in Hartford. This then became the center for the deaf institutes in America. This was a mix of French Sign Language, homespun American signs, and sign dialect from Martha's Vineyard. On Martha's Vineyard, there was a rare hereditary form of deafness, so there was a community of deaf people there. And at this school, and with these three different types of sign language, this is where American ASL, or American Sign Language, came from. So moving on from there, once this was established, there was about 50 years of prosperous where the deaf were actually accepted as human beings and were in society in America and working normally. This was then followed by Alexander Graham Bell, established the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf. So this was the society wanting the deaf people to use their voices, even though they had their own form of language. This created a huge divide in America between the deaf and the hearing, where actually it culminated at a conference where it was decided that manualisms, where you use your hands to speak, was no longer allowed to be taught in schools. So a lot of teachers were laid off and things like that. So by the end of World War I, almost 80% of the deaf were taught without signs. So this means they were forced to use lip reading, or they had to read everything that they were doing, and they had really no form of speaking. So then it wasn't until the 1960s when linguist William Stoke published Sign Language Structure, which is when sign language was actually accepted as a true form of language with different, consonants and vowels and adverbs and everything like that to make it an actual language. And as time progressed, more and more deaf transitioned to deaf schools, where we see today almost a majority of the deaf are actually in specialized schools. And as we will see, this turns into be a center for a lot of deaf culture, is the schools and where they come from. So at a young age, deafness can definitely be of huge impact on a child's life. Children, this is kind of just interesting, but children learn sign and store the information on the left side of their brain, which is the language part, where adults learning sign language store on the right side. So babies and young children will look at sign language as actual language, where adults might look at them more as pictures and things like that. If no oral communication is reached by the child, they may feel isolated. This can kind of make sense that if you had no way of talking to someone and no way of listening to somebody, you'd feel like you're in your own little world. You're not a part of the world, society. And that can feel very, deteriorating. And I personally would hate that. It can take years for a diagnosis to be given of what's wrong with a child. This is just because the severity of different uh, deafness. Uh, a lot of times it could be, maybe they have a buildup of earwax or things like that. So a lot of times every test has to be run before deafness is really thrown out there. Even if the parent is, certain that my child doesn't know my own voice, well, the doctor has to rule different things out before it can be 100% put forward. So this was interesting as well, is that deaf-born to deaf parents are 3 times as likely to learn written English than those born to hearing. So this makes sense to me that if you were born to, deaf parents as a deaf child, you would therefore have the ability to be taught by your parents how the world works and how deaf culture works. Where if 2 hearing parents have a deaf child, they're therefore learning with the child on how it works. So this is a great quote on page 56 that says, "Culture provides a way for deaf people to reimagine themselves as not as so much adapting to the present, but inheriting the past. It allows them to think of themselves not as unfinished hearing people, but as cultural and linguistic beings in a collective world with one another. It gives them a reason for existing with others in the modern world." So, moving on, this is from psychologist Neil Gleickman, who gave 4 stages to being deaf and the different stages that people go through. So the first is pretending to be deaf or pretending to be hearing in order to fit in. So this is definitely young children who don't want to be, on the outside or anything like that. So they try and pretend that they're normal or that they fit in, like they feel like they don't. Because of this, they certainly start to feel as though they don't fit in either one, because they don't fit with the hearing people. They don't really know that many deaf people, and if maybe they do, they may not have a good experience with it, which then leads to not wanting either one. Once deaf culture is actually accepted, a lot of times they will disown the hearing culture. So this can be, you've grown up in a society for 15 plus years that it's always been hearing, and this is how you've known, where you can grow now there's a whole different side of your life that you could have been a part of, and now you hate the hearing world because they took this part from you. And then the final stage is learning the importance of both and understanding that they are different but they are the same, and they have to work with each other in order to be successful in the modern world. So I thought this was an amazing quote by psychiatrist Neil Gleickman. Again, so he describes that when a child is born to deaf parents, they need to find their culture on their own. This means that deaf adults, when they see a deaf child, may want to intervene and not let the parents. The issue arises when the parents believe that their child cannot be deaf and won't allow them to experience their culture. A deaf child also belongs to the deaf community and cannot be 100% the parents. Now, I thought this quote was phenomenal because it definitely points out that being deaf already accepts you into a culture that by hearing you're not allowed in. So this would make sense that by knowing someone who is deaf and by being deaf, seeing someone else struggle, you might want to not allow the parents, to do the wrong thing or to make the mistakes, where sometimes the mistakes are needed to happen so the parent can learn along with the child to learn. So moving on, being deaf as a choice. So this comes from MJ Bienvenue. She says, "I am deaf," she said, drawing out the sign for deaf, the index finger moving from the chin to ear as though she were tracing a broad smile. "To see myself as deaf is as much of a choice as it is for me to identify as a lesbian. I am living my cultures. I don't define myself in terms of not hearing or not anything else. Those who learned forced English while being denied sign emerge semi-lingual rather than bilingual, and they are disabled. But for the rest of us, it is no more a disability than being Japanese would." So finally, moving on, my hopeful life experience is that I would really, really hope that we can all respect the deaf as for who they are. As I said here, sometimes they may not want to be fixed. So this is really important that a lot of times people who are deaf, they don't look at themselves as they have an ailment, but as if they almost have a strength that, they're part of something that we aren't a part of, that we can't be a part of it. And then the deaf community may be one of the most in-depth and complex cultures that we know of. The amount of emotion that can go into when you're signing and the thoughts and the facial expressions that lead up to everything. It's really a very complex language that I don't think that we truly, as hearing people, at least I don't truly understand the depth of it, but I know that it is extremely depth. Allowing children to find their own path at times, but we can guide it sometimes. This is especially working with obviously deaf children, allowing them to find their own culture, because we don't know what their culture is. We don't know how, you know, how they feel or what they're thinking. So we have to be accepting of what they say they feel and things like that. And then being accepting of who they are and allowing mistakes. Especially growing up, a lot of these stories that I read, a lot of them were pushed down by their parents or peers, saying that, trying the same thing a million times and still getting it wrong. Well, maybe you're not focusing on the right thing. So definitely for me growing up, I want to work with any deaf child as if they're my own, and to teach them, that the world is accepting and they do have their own part and they shouldn't be out all on their own. So yeah, that's my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you.